volume is just this putting things up.
Good evening. I'd like to thank everybody for coming on a particularly cold Friday evening. I know it's the end of a very busy week for a lot of us. My name is Rebecca Thorpe, and I'm the political science faculty representative for the Stice lecture. I'd like to welcome everyone here on behalf of the political science department. Steve Paff from the sociology department will say a few words about the Stice lectureship series. And Victor Minaldo, my colleague in political science, will introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Barry Weingast. And time permitting, there's going to be a brief question and answer section at the end of the lecture, followed by a faculty reception, which everyone is invited to in the Walker Ames room that's in Kane 225. Steve?
Good evening and welcome to the Earl and Edna Stice Lectureship in Social Science. The Stice Committee is delighted that Professor Weingast could be here at the University of Washington. In the past 2 decades, a number of outstanding lecturers have come to the university under the sponsorship of this endowment, each spending time on campus meeting with faculty and graduate students and talking about their ideas. We have this lectureship because of the work and generosity of 4 people. I'd like to tell you a bit about them and the origin of the lectureship. Glenn Stice was a social psychologist who worked for more than 20 years at Educational Testing Services in Princeton. He was something of a Renaissance person, with a wide variety of interests and a commitment to the social sciences. In the mid-1980s, nearing the end of his life, he decided to create a lectureship that would assure continued discussion on topics he thought were important to the academy and to society: ethics, politics, community, epistemology, philosophy of law, privacy in an urban society, and the Bill of Rights. Glenn turned to a good friend of his, Philip Bloomstein, a University of Washington sociology professor, to help him define and then start the lectureship. Glenn gave this lectureship to the University of Washington because Phil Bloomstein was here, and Phil created the governance structure for the lectureship before his death in 1991. Glenn stipulated that the lectureship memorialize his parents. Earl and Edna Stice established a small regional telephone company in central Illinois in the first half of the 20th century. When they sold their company to AT&T, they shared the proceeds with their 3 children, exhorting them each to do something of value with the money. The lectureship is the product, then, of their work, of Glenn's generosity, and Phil Bloomstein's guidance.
My name is Victor Minaldo. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department, and I'm honored and privileged to introduce Barry Weingast tonight. Before telling you a bit about Professor Weingast and why he's an ideal analyst and communicator of Adam Smith's ideas, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time briefly previewing what Barry's going to say tonight and making a pitch tailored especially to this audience for why his lecture should really matter to us tonight. Barry will be speaking tonight about why some countries are rich and others are poor. He will discuss Adam Smith's answer to this question and argue that Smith's answer, which was originally published in 1776, remains both seriously misunderstood and still vitally applicable today. Barry believes that understanding the sequence of events whereby Europe transitioned from the violence and relative deprivation of feudalism to the relative order and prosperity associated with widespread liberalism and commercialism is critical. Barry often makes the point that modern specialized economies don't spring fully formed like Athena from Zeus's brow. And for most of human history, politics has been nasty business. And he uses these words, nasty. Democracy, pluralism, and prosperity are, alas, exceptions to the general rule. He also argues that these insights about Adam Smith are critical to understanding development today, as well as why development efforts often fail. These insights should matter greatly to the folks in this room for several reasons that have been outlined and practiced by Barry throughout his career, and which he will allude to today. First, truly comprehending how development occurs can only happen through a truly interdisciplinary approach to social science. And that's something we espouse here at UW, and Barry's taken very seriously throughout his career. Second, we should spend our scarce and valuable resources and time asking the biggest and most enduring and most important questions in social science. Most importantly, I think, as both citizens and influencers of public policy, one of the key lessons to draw from Barry's work and his approach to Adam Smith is that sometimes it might behoove us to put our good intentions aside and embrace the mantra that it's better to do nothing and do no harm than to unwittingly melt the glue that holds societies together as we attempt to promote democracy and development abroad. We are therefore very fortunate to have Barry here tonight to deliver the Stice Lecture. He is eminently qualified to tackle the question of how and why development occurs through an interdisciplinary perspective. Throughout his career, Barry has explored the issues of order and cooperation and how these political foundations have influenced specialization, productivity, and economic development. His approach has been characterized by a disregard for conventional academic and intellectual boundaries. And I know that sounds like a cliche that is often said about a lot of folks, but Barry truly embodies this idea to the nth degree. He's a consummate scientist in that his instinct is to universalize, uncovering the underlying logic behind seemingly disparate data points. A common theme that runs across Barry's work is that although the details may vary, including the proper nouns, human motives and strategic predicaments are often the same, even though they're expressed vastly differently across different times and places. What does this imply for the big puzzles that, much like Adam Smith, Barry's grappled with throughout his career? Barry has provided, through this approach, counterintuitive and iconoclastic answers to the questions of why underdevelopment, authoritarianism, and civil conflict persist, despite our pretensions to being more knowledgeable, compassionate, and open-minded than our ancestors. He's made us understand why, even when individuals may share a desire for more stability and peace and greater liberty, equality, and prosperity, it's often difficult for everybody to simultaneously surrender whatever benefits they obtain in a dysfunctional and lopsided social order, where the few do much better than the many, but could potentially be better off in a more liberal, democratic order. For all his tremendous intellectual contributions, Barry is an incredibly unassuming person, and a lot of you who have gotten to know him since he arrived here on Wednesday can attest to that fact. He does not tend to indulge in self-promotion or the reflection of his numerous accomplishments. So that's left to me to do a bit. But in the spirit of his humility, I just want to mention in passing, and without going into painstaking detail, that his own intellectual contributions have been formidable, far-reaching, and extremely influential. In that spirit, I want to welcome Barry Weingast to our intellectual community here at the UW. I want to be able to relish the cross-fertilization of ideas and methods that he's introduced across political science, economics, and even anthropology and sociology by paying very careful attention to what he has to say about how Adam Smith's work is still very vital to us today. So without further ado, please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Professor Weingast visiting us here from Stanford University.
I'm not sure I'm capable of living up to that introduction, so let me begin by saying it's been terrific to be here. I felt I've had, despite the weather, such an amazingly warm reception from all the people that have been here, and it's been a great 3 days and talking to a wide range of people, students, faculty, and the like, and it's been a great pleasure. It's also an honor to be here to give the Earl and Edna Stice lecture, and I appreciate your having me, and I hope I have something to say that might be of interest. So, Adam Smith, in his most famous work, The Wealth of Nations, asked what accounts for the fact that nations have different levels of opulence. Opulence was the word he used about being rich. and he thought there was a natural path to opulence, and thereby wondered why it is that so many countries fail to take the natural path. That is, why do so many countries remain poor? Well, the intransigence of this problem remains today, and the questions that he asked are as relevant today as they were then, and so too, I want to argue today, were his answers to this question. So I want to begin with the essence of the violence trap. And this is a summary of Thucydides, who wrote about the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BCE. And this is my colleague in classics and political science, Josh Ober, summarizing. And he says, to survive, a community needs a wall for protection. But walls require money and resources. How do you get money and resources in this world, the old Greek world? Well, it's through trade or plunder. But to do so, you need ships. How do you get ships? Well, without walls, you don't have the security to build ships. And that's the essence of the trap, the violence trap. Well, I'm going to formulate it a little differently, but I think you'll see that that gives, that Thucydides understood this some time ago. So, as I said, why are poverty and underdevelopment so persistent? Well, a good many theories, all of which have some insights. The first is that countries that are poor have bad policies. They fail to implement what economists know well is the way to create markets. And I think economists are very good at that as far as knowing what kind of policies are necessary to have markets. Another argument, an older argument and a newer argument is that countries that are poor have less capital, that they have less capital, and therefore the value of the marginal product of labor and all that is low, and as a consequence they don't grow. Another one is education. They're inadequately educated. Good governance has been around for the most last 15 years. We need to have better governance, rule of law. Another argument is that there are incumbent risks, and incumbents feel that if they liberalize, that the chances they stay in office will go down, and therefore they protect themselves through bad policies. I think there's some insight in all of these, but all are inadequate as a complete guide, and so underdevelopment remains a puzzle. I want to argue that the real problem comes down to this violence trap, that the biggest component missing from economics, or the economics of development, is the idea of violence. And there's inattention to violence as a margin on which people compete. And so as a consequence, in environments where there is violence and people react to violence, there's an inadequate understanding of what people are doing, how people behave, and the choices they make. I'm also going to argue that violence is endemic. I'll show you some figures in a minute. And suggesting that all countries, all developing countries, must solve the problem of violence. I'm also going to argue that there's a natural solution to violence. Natural in the sense that most states in history have used this form, in fact almost all states in history, and only in the last century or so has a different kind of state emerged that solves the problem of violence differently. And the way that the natural solution is, we call this the natural state. The way the natural state works is through rent creation. That is, it creates rents, and the idea is that it creates rents and gives them to the powerful people so that those that are powerful, that is, those with the resources to fight, have an incentive to cooperate because of the rents rather than fight. Of course, in order to have rent creation, you need to protect rents, and that means that there's limits on competition, typically both in economics and politics. Competition erodes the rents or dissipates the rents. Often there's a system of privilege, typically, rather than rights, and the reason is that those people that have power get different rights and privileges than those that do not have power. Another feature of this state is the lack of perpetuity, that is, the lack of perpetualness. Perpetualness in the form of institutions are institutions that live beyond the lives of the people that create them. So a corporation, a partnership, for example, is not a perpetual institution because the organization dies upon one of the death of the partners or when one of the partners simply wants out. Whereas a corporation is perpetually live. That's not infinitely live, but perpetually live because the institutions of the corporation live beyond those that create them. And through the way the shares have perpetual lives. Natural states do not have perpetuity. They often change the nature of the leaders often change the nature of the rules when they come into power. Putin is a good example. Finally, I'm going to argue that, as you've now heard 3 times, I'm going to argue that the violence trap is at the base of this. And that means an absence of property rights and the rule of law. The problem with those is that they are impersonal. It's very hard to have rule of law when certain people have to have privileges in order to keep the peace. There's a threat of violence, and this adds risk. The threat of violence adds risk to many types of investments. So there's certain kinds of investments that are very vulnerable to fighting that don't take place, that might otherwise be profitable, but for the violence. All right, so here's the outline. We're going to talk a little bit about endemic violence, how natural states mitigate the problem of violence. We'll talk more about the violence trap itself. And then I'm going to turn to Adam Smith and talk about his arguments in Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations about feudalism as a violent trap and a low-growth equilibrium, and then also his ideas about how Europe escaped the violence trap. And I'll draw a few conclusions. So here's some simple data on endemic violence. And what we're looking at here is regime duration. And so we define, this is work with Gary Cox and Doug North, we define a regime in an incredibly narrow way. A regime is a set of rulers who live on without violent turnover. So this is as long as there's peaceful turnover, regardless of what the rules are, you have a regime. So if there's a coup or a civil war that dislodges the leaders, the regime ends. And so we ask the question, how long do regimes last in the world? And I've got 3 categories here. On the left, we have the poorest half of the distribution of countries by income. So this is the poorest half of the world. And you can see the number of years that between violent regimes, the median number of years is 7. So this means in half the world, they experience, half of the countries experience violent takeover every 7 years, which means they've got a very short time horizon. If we look at the richest developing countries, these are the countries that are the so-called middle-income countries. This is places like Argentina and Brazil and Venezuela and Chile. These countries do better than the poorest half, but not by a whole lot. The median country in that category, the richest developing countries, goes about 12.5 years between violent succession. In contrast, the developed world, the median lasts 60 years. So in other words, there's something very different about the behavior of the developed world than the developing world. All right. So key features of the natural state environment. I've said it, but not quite this way. There's distributive violence potential, meaning that there are multiple sources of violence in the society. So take Mexico. Mexico is one of the richer developing countries. It's had a lot of peace. It has not had coups or military takeovers since about 1930 with the formation of the Institutional Revolutionary Party known as the PRI. And yet there are multiple sources of violence. So obviously the military is one. Another are the teachers' unions, or the unions in general. They've been known to take over states, to strike in ways that prevent states from operating as part of their demands for what they want. Another source of violence is Pemex. Pemex are the initials of the oil company there, and they maintain an army. In part as a way of defending their privileges, so that if there were serious kinds of reforms that they were unwilling to accept, it would be very difficult because the number of people that they employ for the use of violence is rather large. And that's obviously a deterrent to certain kinds of reforms. And finally, in Mexico, we have the drug lords. I shouldn't say finally. There's also the revolts and rebellions by native peoples as well. So there are multiple sources in Mexico of violence, and it's one of the richer countries. I think many of the poorer countries have many more sources of that. As another example, the military in many societies, Argentina, Brazil, Thailand, and of course in the middle years of the Korean Republic, South Korean Republic, the military is very important, and coup threats are prominent. So what are the tactics to reduce violence? Well, here I want to recognize the work that I've done with Doug North and John Wallace. That's called NWW for North, Wallace, and Weingast. a book we wrote in 2009. I'm not that old. Called Violence and Social Orders, a conceptual framework for understanding recorded human history. And I've already given you some of the hints, but I want to talk a little bit more about it. So again, here's rent creation. I mentioned it at the outset. Rent creation is in a large number of ways rent's created. Somebody may get a local monopoly on beer, or cement, or a monopoly on the use of the grain mill, and so that anybody who wants to mill their grain has to come to the monopolist. Another one is telephones, for example. There may be a telephone monopoly. There are lots of ways in which firms get protection from competition. Sometimes it's in the form of tariffs and external protection. Sometimes it's in the form of subsidies. Many firms get substantial subsidies and privileges. Has anybody here had the privilege of flying to India? You remember when what time you landed? Not in the middle of the day? Well, the first time I went there, we could only get flights that landed between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. and found it's a little quizzical, isn't it? So being students of regulation that I was with, we spent a fair amount of time divining what was this about. And it turns out there's only one airline that's allowed to land during the day, Air India. So if you want to fly during the day, during a normal hour, and land, say, at noon or take off at noon, you have to fly Air India, whereas our flight left at 3 in the morning. It wasn't a pleasant experience. Key insight, though. Okay, so rent creation makes groups with violent potential better off cooperating than fighting. That's the key insight. And so the structure of the natural state is designed to maintain this, to maintain peace through these various ways of creating privileges and rents. We have another implication on this. Here it says the main implication, but it's the idea of the proportionality principle. And it's the idea that rents, as we said, rents must exceed the value of fighting. And so that means that people that are more powerful, that is those that are more powerful militarily and more likely to win if they have a fight, well, they have to get more rents. In order so that this incentive compatibility constraint is satisfied. That's a big word, isn't it? The incentive compatibility constraint is simply the sentence under the proportionality principle. Rents must exceed the value of fighting so that there's an incentive to not fight. And when people are stronger than others, they need more, the stronger need more resources. And failing to do so means violence. So violence requires this proportionality principle. Another fact is that direct methods of solving violence typically fail. So here are a couple. One is unilateral disarmament. One side may decide, well, this fighting's not a good idea, so why don't we stop it, and we'll do so by putting down our arms unilaterally. Well, that's kind of problematic in these environments because it means that they become vulnerable because they have no arms. And so the other side may say, boy, that's great, maybe we'll think about doing the same thing, all the while that they're preparing to take advantage opportunistically of those that had a unilateral disarmament. Another important way of maintaining peace is economic integration. And the idea of economic integration is that it becomes costly to fight when economies are integrated because the value of my production goes way down if I fight you, if my supply chains goes through you and you're on the opposite side. And so there's a tendency not to economically integrate in economies where they're likely to be fighting, precisely because it means you become vulnerable when fights break out. And so that makes it harder. The fact that you become vulnerable and the fact that there's a risk of fighting means that those kind of investments are less likely to occur than investments that don't have that problem. So, so here's an important lesson. Economists, when they look at natural states, they see market intervention and directly unproductive profit-seeking. So that's the way they view the nature of the policies that control markets. And at the level of observation, they are exactly right. This is what happens, in the sense that there's lots of regulatory controls that prevent competitive markets from working, and that have obvious benefits for particular interest groups that we've identified as those at least having some form of violence potential. Bob Waddy, who uses this term unproductive profit seeking, wants to emphasize that this is a whole waste, that these kind of rents are a waste. And I think that obscures the logic of the natural state. So the idea is that the economists have the observations correct, but the inference as to what's going on is not correct. And the reason is the problem is not that there's rent seeking, that people actually want these rents and advocate rents. The problem is violence. And without solving the problem of violence, the most efficacious way to solve, without mitigating violence in some other way, the most efficacious way to do it is through rent creation. And so in this world, rents, in fact, are productive because what they're doing is preventing fighting and allowing a degree of cooperation. Nonetheless, you can see what's happening. The natural states are led naturally to these policies of market control and creation of rents and limits on competition, and all that has the natural effect that economists know and have known for years. In fact, Adam Smith in his book 4 talks quite a bit about this. But so nonetheless, this is a piece of the violence trap. Natural state policies keep developing countries poor because they hinder the natural workings of the market in ways that make people rich. I want to say a little bit about what's the alternative to the natural state. And this we call, meaning Doug North and John Wallace and I in our book, NWW, we talk about developed countries as being open access countries. So the natural state, I didn't say this, is a limited access country, meaning that there's limited access to organizations, limited access to competition in both politics, economics, and other walks of life. And that's natural as a means of protecting those that are in power. Open access, in contrast, has open access, meaning that almost anyone that wants can form an organization. So you want to form a corporation, this is an administrative detail. It's not unlike registering to vote or getting a driver's license, although the forms tend to be a little bit more complicated. These countries are characterized by the rule of law and impersonality. That is, you have rights by virtue of being a citizen, not who you are and not who you're associated with. The rules are perpetual. So the new a new president of France is elected, and he typically or she accepts the rules. The rules are what they were. The rules during the term are what they were at the beginning, and they'll be the same at the end typically, unless they're sometimes changed by the constitutionally recognized process. These states also have political control over the military. That's one of the things we know the least about how that gets rigged. That's kind of a hard problem. I've already said open access to organizations. And the final piece is economic integration. So these economies are characterized by long supply chains and complex economic integration. And what that does when the investments are sufficiently large is it makes fighting really prohibitively costly. And so that no one wants to fight, even when there are disputes. I'm not going to say much more about that because the key is that I'm interested in today is how countries get out of the violence trap. All right, so one thing to do is to consider a new leader's choices following violence. Well, one thing the leader could do, so a new leader takes over. What does a new leader want to do? Well, one option, obviously, is to maintain the natural state, possibly with the cards moved around so the players that are most important are a little different. Or they could try this idea of economic reform. And I want to suggest some of the things that they might do, because these are the kind of things that economists in the World Bank recommend. So one might be to remove policies creating rents. Another is to relax limits on access. But both those are problematic, even though they may have potentially beneficial effects on the market. And the reason is if the country is being held together by rents, that is, that rents are the glue that keeps them at peace, if you engineer policies that are undoing those rents, like competition and relaxing regulatory restrictions, opening access and the like, then what you're really doing is undoing the glue that's holding society together. So rather than produce economic reform and economic growth, you're actually risking producing disorder and the worse. And even people who are exploited under a natural state have a preference in general for peace over the disorder that comes about from fighting. And so one of the things, I won't go through all these, but one of the things that occurs in natural states is they're very resistant to economic reform. This is something that the standard approach has very little to say about other than to say, well, it's interest groups. I think it's more than interest groups. It has a lot to do with fears of disorder and violence. I think I already said that. So the violence trap, therefore, implies that the natural state is stable. It's something of an equilibrium. It's summarized by these things. I've said almost all of this. Distributed violence potential, of course. The lack of impersonality. So the idea of property rights and the rule of law requires impersonality in the sense that everybody is equal before the law, that you come and you are judged by the basis of the facts involving the contract, not by virtue of the fact that some so-and-so sent you, or that you're part of a particular organization, and thereby a hurt to you is a hurt to everybody in the organization. And so at best, natural states develop slowly, and many don't develop at all. All right, now we turn to Adam Smith and on Europe's escape from the violence trap. So how did Europe escape from the violence trap and become rich? Well, Adam Smith provided an answer for this in The Wealth of Nations in his book 3. The Wealth of Nations, for those of you know, is 5 books. It is almost 1,000 pages long, and the book 3 is by far the shortest. It's about 50 pages, 5% of the total. And in this is a narrative that most economists eschew reading or put aside. In the history of economic thought, there's a great number of economists who write in there who say that it is a diversion. But I actually think that part of that what's going on in this is not that it's a diversion, that it's written in the theory is embedded in the narrative, and you have to extract it. And that Adam Smith may well have attempted in another venue that he never completed but promised to complete, developing a more general theoretical story so that it might have been abstract rather than simply told in the form of a story or a narrative. So let me give you a suggestion of the outline of it. And recall I said we were first going to discuss the feudal equilibrium, why feudalism was stable, and then we'll talk about how Europe got out of feudalism, or at least parts of Europe got out of feudalism. So the idea is, of course, that feudalism is an equilibrium. It's an equilibrium of the type of the violence trap. Some facts about the king. The king is one notable among the notables, the chief lord, the chief great lord, but not so powerful that he or she can impose her will across the country. That is, impose her will in the sense of some kind of justice and prevention of violence. Not particularly more powerful than the barons, and therefore could not provide security, property rights, or impose order. In fact, that was left to the barons. So here's a quote from Smith: "Neither the kings nor the great lords could prevent violence. In those disorderly times, every great landlord was a sort of petty prince. His tenants were his subjects. He was their judge. He made war according to his own discretion, frequently against his neighbors and sometimes against the sovereign." So this is a little sense of the nature of the equilibrium. They're always fighting, is in his view, and I think this accords well with the nature of the natural state. The local lords captured most of the local surplus, and much of the local surplus went to support the lords' military organization. This is, in a sense, something of an arms race. This is not something, what I'm talking about now is not something Smith said, but if you think about the military competition, If one lord devotes all of his surplus to it and the next lord devotes only half of his surplus, the lord that devotes all his surplus has a military advantage over the other lord. And so there's a tendency to move toward most of the surplus going to support retainers and the armies that are associated with each of the great lords. In contrast, most people, meaning most of the peasants, lived at subsistence. There was little investment in this world. As Smith said, men in this defenseless state naturally content themselves with their necessary subsistence because to acquire more might only tempt the injustice of their oppressors. In other words, this was a world without property rights. There was expropriation of investments, and hence the incentive to keep your nose down and not be noticed. This world was poor, violent, and underdeveloped. One of the things that changed, I think, and this is not something Smith discusses the idea of the expansion of European-wide trade, but he doesn't explain where that comes from. And in particular, why at a particular moment? Wasn't there always scarcity? Well, one way to think about this is the logic in on North and Thomas, which was written when Doug North was here. It was a 73 book. And the idea there is that over time, the feudal enclaves were using all of the local resources. So in the beginning of feudalism, trees are so cheap that they're rarely priced. But over a couple hundred years, the nearby trees and the good tree and the best trees get chopped down, and so scarcity gets worse, and and resources like trees begin to be priced. Well, after a while, they become very valuable because it's hard to get them. And so there's an incentive, I think, a growing incentive for trade relative to the risk involved. And in particular, there's potential gains from these coastal towns to trade, to specialize, to make investments. The problem is the political underpinnings of this. So again, endemic violence and predation. So here's a quote that's about the traders specifically. And Adam Smith says, the wealth which they, that is the traders, did manage to accumulate under such unfavorable conditions was subject to the arbitrary exactions of both the king and the lords on whose territories they might happen to be based or through which they might pass. Thus, the violence trap. So Smith argues that a certain degree of certain subsets of people actually get out of this, and they get out through a kind of political exchange, and it's between the king and the town. So these tiny little towns, which are subject to harassment by local lords, often the traders that are in them, Smith says, are actually slaves of the local lords, but they take steps away from the natural state through this political exchange. And the reason is they have an incentive to cooperate against the great lords. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, so to speak, as Smith says. And so the king and the town ally. And they create new arrangements. There are new possibilities, in particular, for the defense of towns that provide security and allow for towns to begin to grow. So what the king gets is fixed taxes. So the king gets resources, and over time the king is rising through this, becoming more than just the chief of the great lords, but becoming more rich relative to the other lords. And in exchange, the towns are granted political freedom, the right of self-government, the right to make laws, collect taxes, build walls, defend themselves. So this political exchange creates three simultaneous revolutions, and this is very important because this is something that's missing from today's logic, and that is they create liberty being personal freedom as well as justice. Justice meaning things like the law of contracts, the rule of law more broadly. Commerce is his word for the growth of the economy. The economy is necessary, of course, to get rich and to have resources for these other things. And the third piece is security. That is protection of violence. Without security, none of this would have worked. And so Smith says, order and good government, and along with them liberty and security of individuals, were in this manner established in the cities at a time when the occupiers of the land and the country were exposed to every sort of violence. So in other words, they begin to have these islands of security and liberty where people are actually able to create markets and make investments, and they start to get rich. And as they do that, the towns extend their reach into the countryside. Smith says, commerce and manufacturers gradually introduce order and good government, and with them the liberty, security of individuals among the inhabitants of the country who had lived almost in a continual state of war with their neighbors and of servile dependence upon their superiors. So what Smith is saying here is that the local communities, agriculture communities outside, nearby the towns, actually make a transformation from self-sufficient agriculture and very poor peasantry into market specialists where they are growing things such as food for the towns or other kinds of substance such as grain that the town then trades on the international market. And so as a consequence, the division of labor grows. They get richer, both the town and the peasants. And all the while, a necessary condition for this is the military superiority of the towns over the lords. You can see that that's a necessary condition, right? Had there not been this military superiority, then the lords would have simply crushed them and extracted all of the value at some point early on. But in fact, the towns have military superiority in part because it's so much easier for them to coordinate. I could say more about that, but I think I will move on in the interest of time. So towns then bring property rights, security, and investment into the countryside, and the countryside around the towns start to get rich. This is something of a positive feedback loop, something economists call at some time. It's associated with the idea of the trap. Places that escape traps often have a positive feedback loop, and the idea is that if you extend yourself into the countryside, there's greater opportunity for division of labor, specialization, and exchange. The nature of the market grows larger, and that allows more investment, more capital, as well as more funds for defense, and so the town is able to then expand the area in which it has its domain, and hence expand the area in which there is division of labor and the market, and grow richer yet, and thereby expand again. That's the nature of this positive feedback loop. Presumably it ends as some margin gets eaten up, such as the ability, the economies of scale and violence. I haven't seen a theory of this. It's something to do. And so Smith says, with the establishment of some regular government, without some authority to compel their inhabitants to act according to some certain plan, no voluntary league of mutual defense could either have afforded them permanent security or have enabled them to give the king any considerable support. So in other words, the nature of the government is really a key piece in making this all work, because the government is coordinating people's behavior and at once creating the various plans that are making things, the different pieces, the three simultaneous revolutions of liberty, commerce, and security. So in terms of the model that Gary Cox and I haven't mentioned this yet, although I've summarized it. So this is a paper with Cox, North, and Weingast, 2013. The feudal system then is in equilibrium. It's a natural state, distributive violence, and it's subject to the violence trap. Shocks occur in this world, that is exogenous shocks. In this case, the value and possibilities of trade rise. So at some point, the risk in trading is taken. And there's a non-incremental response. That's one of the key things. It's not an incremental response in terms of small things. The town and king's political exchange create a new entity, the corporation of the town, and the town behaves very differently than its neighbors. I think I've said most of this. Walls, security, greater investment, specialization allows trade to provide growth, and towns extend their reach into the countryside, thereby generating more wealth. Something I'm not going to emphasize very much, but is relevant here. Smith talks quite a bit about the social changes that this occurs, as the warlords in the great lords no longer need to rely on their mass armies once they're under the umbrella in the town. He spends quite a bit of that discussion of that in the Wealth of Nations, and especially his lectures on jurisprudence. All right, so let's come back to the modern world. International donor agencies in modern economics often focus on standard economic incremental reform model. That is, reform this market, get rid of that policy and the like. It's focused typically on market reform, good governance is there, democracy and the like. And I think that if you're talking about a natural state, one of the problems of picking up the piece out of an open access order, that is the modern developed world, such as democracy, and sticking it into a natural state is problematic. It doesn't work the same way. It doesn't have the infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure to make it work in the same way. And that those things, that if you really created democracy in a natural state, what you're doing is saying that the rules are up for grabs to the majority, and that means that those that are powerful but small are likely to have their privileges taken away. And so as a consequence, those kind of interests will either fight against democracies, or when their interests come to be threatened, won't play by the rules. And I think Chile 1973, where the military engineered a coup in part to at the service of the landowners who were being threatened by the regime, I think is an example of why democracy doesn't work in those. Simply having elections doesn't solve problems in those settings. So ignoring the problem of violence and the logic of natural states makes it very difficult to figure out how to make a difference. And it also ignores Adam Smith's lesson, that is this really non-incremental change that simultaneously worries about creating liberty, commerce, and security. The traditional reform approach has failed for 30 years. This is something that Easterly emphasizes. And I think that one of the things it says is that the problem of development is harder to solve than economists and donor agencies and all of us really realize, that natural states are stable, that they have lots of forces that want to keep them as natural states, and that Adam Smith, in his way, pointed in a different way and thought of the problem a little differently in terms of the violence trap and escaping from the violence trap. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Professor Weingast, for such a stimulating and incisive talk. We have time for just a couple questions from the audience. Yes.
I admire your attempt to interpret The Wealth of Nations, but Book 3 actually begins with a very interesting remark.
Mm-hmm.
When the German and the Scythian nations overran the western provinces of the Roman Empire, a period of violence embarked.
Yes.
And of course, the two big innovations which Smith discusses are, one, the introduction of primogeniture, and the doctrine of strict entail, which ensured that all of the land in Europe would be owned and, of course, dispersed among a certain segment. But before that, in the introduction and plan of work of The Wealth of Nations, Smith talks about the two major variables that leads an economy to grow. One is the ratio of productive to unproductive expenditure, and the other is the aggregate productivity of labor across both productive and unproductive labor in both the private sector and, of course, in the governmental sector.
Mm-hmm.
But he is not able to tell us in the 18th century why Britain really grew when it had an enormous number of wars starting from the early part of the century up until 1815, when the Napoleonic Wars ended.
Mm-hmm.
In truth and in fact, what really did lead Britain to grow and what characterizes the Industrial Revolution was that for the first time in human history, we saw the birth of an entirely new industry. And that industry is what I call the modern capital goods industry.
Mm-hmm.
James Watt's engine provided an independent source of power. The new materials industry coming from the blast furnace, and of course machinery,
yes,
which allowed precision activity to take place. Once those three were integrated, then Britain could begin to grow and transform that past.
yes.
Today, if you look at all the developing countries, and I've been to 140 of them, the most striking thing is that there isn't a poor country that has a capital goods industry.
Yeah. Well, that's that's a good tour de force through much of the wealth of nations, and I'm sorry that we're not able to talk, in greater detail so that most of the audience is able to see the value of that. But I think that it's important to separate out two issues. One issue has to do with what began the escape from the violence trap and what allowed Britain to get really rich in the Industrial Revolution. And I think you're right. Your last remark, I think, is the most important one about capital goods industries, because those are the heavy investments that are the most easily exploited by political opportunism. And in places where political opportunism, that is where there's not perpetual rule, where you don't have impersonal rights, where you have privileges, are exactly the places that make it the hardest to make those investments. And so, in a sense, that's part of the violence trap. Right, so you come back in the way you ended is exactly reflecting the logic of the violence trap.
I disagree, but that's
Of course. Another question?
Professor.
I have a question. So, some sociologists like Max Weber and Norbert Elias didn't put the problem exactly as you did, but they argued that these absolute, what they would have characterized as absolute states, the post-feudal kings that are getting much more powerful, that the absolute states monopolize the means of violence, help to create this violence problem. But they go another step too forward. I'm just wondering what you thought about it. They also say that it leads to a dispositional or behavioral change. In other words, a change in the set of incentives for ordinary people to get ahead that made them more tractable, more easily governed, less prone to eruptions of violence and so on, and pointed not only to indicators like economic growth, but also things like lower rates of homicides, lower rates of other sorts of things. I'm wondering if you see, you also think that a behavioral dispositional change matters also in the story of escaping the violence trap.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. Let me make an observation before I come back to the question. And the observation is looking at the absolute states that have a monopoly on violence or a larger monopoly on violence is quite a ways away from the moment that I'm talking about, right? Because that's something that comes along later. But I think you're exactly right about these temperamental natures of things. And of course, there's this huge literature in the 17th and 18th century on the passions and how to control the passions. And I think it's wrapped up exactly in that issue of how it is that people come to be able to see and make calculations over the long run and eschew the norms of, of chivalry and fighting and reacting very quickly to something. And I think that's very important, a very important part of this process. And Smith, as you probably know, talks quite a bit about this in his 4 stages of history. Of course, as did other people who use the 4 stages of history.
Margaret.
Barry, this is really exciting work, and I'm just trying to figure out how to bring Adam Smith into the present. And one of the things that strikes me in your story is there's a king. And so there's someone to bargain with. And in a lot of developing countries, there isn't. There isn't that same kind of structure. So I'm wondering, are those countries just doomed, or is there a way to develop a king who can then bargain?
Well, that's an interesting question. So one of the things we distinguish in the book is between different types of natural states. And one natural state, the simplest natural state is a fragile natural state. Say a former war-torn area, something that's just come out of violence. A more sophisticated natural state we call a basic natural state. So one of the distinctions has to do with organizations. In a fragile natural state, all organizations are associated very closely with the state. In a basic natural state, there can be independent organizations, but they have to have a connection with the state as well. And then in mature natural states, you get organizations that are actually independent of the state. You get corporations, for example, or other kinds of organizations that don't need the state's permission to exist. They may be restricted as to an elite only can have these. And I think that that's relevant to the question. And I think that part of the development process, we realized that there was not one development problem, but two development problems. And and so we work with the World Bank to produce a second book called In the Shadow of Violence. It's largely case studies of individual countries such as Korea, Bangladesh, Chile, and Mexico, the Philippines. This is a long-winded answer to come back, that I think that part of the problem is in fragile natural states, it's very hard to make fast progress. And the reason is in the aftermath of violence, there's so much distrust and often quite dispersed violence potential, and both of which really make it hard to solve these kinds of problems. So, and I think elections in those kind of settings can be really dangerous because too much is at stake. And if part of the way in which you solve the problem of violence is by limiting choices that protect people with violence, then elections can be very dangerous.
Yes.
Considering how rapidly China is moving from a developing country to a developed country, how do you believe that this phenomenon will impact the Chinese Communist leadership's decisions on how to hold on to power as the economic base grows so rapidly?
Yeah.
See that as a fundamental threat, and or they attempt to somehow maneuver their way to the
Well, I think the first thing to observe about China is that the literature on China seems to reserve the phrase political reform to democracy. And so if democracy is political reform, then there's been no reform in China. But if you think about political reform more broadly in terms of the nature of changing the Constitution and that the rules, and that there has been an advent of rules that impose constraints on the leaders, then China has had considerable political reform. But it's not about, the reform is not about creating competition for leadership. So one of the first things that occurred in the reform in the early 1980s was the fiscal decentralization and the decentralization of regulatory authority to the provinces. Right, this is a major restriction on the nature of the power of the center and was part of what I think was necessary to get the whole thing started, the whole reform started. That said, let me make a second remark about China. China is obviously, in some ways, an economic miracle, moving just immense numbers of people out of poverty. But we have to remember that it's not a rich place. I mean, the size of the economy is so big because it's so big. I mean, it's so large just because China itself is so big. But the average income is still around, I think, $4,000 per capita. And the real difficulty, I think, in the development comes not at that level, but around the 10 to 12 to 14. You know, and how will China deal with that? Both Taiwan and Korea, South Korea, for example, had problems exactly in there. And I think things went relatively well, as you know, so that both are now democracies of sorts. So we'll see how China handles that.
One more question, back.
Yes, my question has to do with the actual concept of violence in the violence trap. When you propose violence in your theory, we kind of assume that violence is actual physical violence, whether that be military's causing the militaries, the police, or private armies, as you mentioned, the PMX. I'm wondering, as the world starts to modernize, and as unions become more or less prevalent, and we start moving industrially and technologically forward, is violence necessarily violent? And a union, for instance, stop a state or create that violence that needs to be overcome without actually hurting another person?
Well, I think one of the things we see historically is that the nature of violence changes over time, and people are always trying to innovate at the margin and create new ways of projecting violence. And I think this certainly is an example you're giving of that. And I think the fact that it changes the nature of warfare because people are less likely to die, I think can affect that, but I'm not sure that it changes the basic nature of violence, right? I mean, because part of what violence is about is holding up parts of the economy, and this is a new tool to do that. It's more sophisticated than the farmers in France encircling Paris and preventing all the trucks from getting into Paris, and thereby threatening people with their daily needs. But that doesn't mean that it's not not violence itself.
That's about all the time that we have. Thank you again, Professor, for visiting DW.
Well, thank you for having us.
For your engaging and provocative talk on the violence trap. I would also like to thank Margaret Levy, Victor Minaldo, and Peter May for helping to make the Political Science Dice Lecture happen and bring Professor Weingast out here. Please join us for further discussion and conversation in the Walker Ames room. That's Kane 225.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect.
I thought so. I read the paper beforehand. Yeah, really interesting stuff.
It's a pleasure to see someone talking about the weather. And I used to lecture